Alright, and welcome to my little quickie video on Quilt as you go. So there's a lot of different ways to do Quilt as you go. A lot of them require putting some sashing in between and using that with your Quilt as you go, but for this particular project that is not suitable because we do not want to add sashing to the front of our quilt. So what we need to do is what's called sashless Quilt as you go. So here I have just a couple of squares that I've been playing with so that I can demonstrate the Quilt as you go method that would be the most suitable for the project we have going on here. Now what you want to do is you want to take your block that you're quilting. So pretend that this is the center of your medallion quilt. So the center of your block of the month, what we have just finished piecing for this month. You're going to want to layer it with your backing and your batting. And you want your backing and your batting to be at least a couple of inches bigger all the way around so that when you're quilting closer to the edge, you have something to hang on to. So when I'm quilting, I want something to hang on to. So I want to make sure that I have lots of backing and batting all the way around the outside of my quilt. We're going to trim that off later, but for now you need that for when you're quilting. And when you're quilting, you want to make sure that you leave at least a ½ an inch unquilted in the area where you're going to join it. So right here are the two edges that I'm going to join. I want to make sure I have at least a ½ an inch that is unquilted. So my first step in joining these is I want to take that batting and the backing and I want to fold it back. And I want to really keep it out of the way. So for this, I'm just going to throw a couple of pins in there to keep it out of the way so that I can sew my two blocks together. And I'm going to do the same thing with this block. I'm just going to take my batting and my backing, fold it out of the way, and just give it a little pin to keep it out of the way. And then I'm going to lay these two pieces right sides together and line up my raw edges here. And I'm going to sew these two blocks together with our usual ½ inch seam. And that is why I want to keep this out of the way. I don't want it to get trapped in the seam. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew this together with a ½ inch seam. There we go. I've sewn these two blocks together with my ½ inch seam. I can take these pins out now because now we just need to deal with the back. I'm going to give that a little press and I'm going to flip it over onto the other side and either press my seam to one. I'm going to press my seam to one way and then we can deal with all this excess right here. There we go. I have my seam pressed. So our next step is to deal with all this excess batting. What we want to do is cut the batting so that it is just flush. We don't want any batting on top of batting, so we don't want it this way. It's just too lumpy. So probably the best way to do that is to just put the batting, kind of squash it so that it's lined up this way. So you can see I have my seam here like that. And I have my seam here like this. But I'm going to do this in 2 steps. So I'm going to lay this down. Line up my ruler right on the edge, cut that off, but then what I need to do is flip this up and cut an additional quarter of an inch off of that. So make sure everything's out of the way, line that up, and cut off an additional ½ inch. And we'll just put some pins to hold that so that it doesn't get in the way. Cut off my additional ½ inch. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. So I'm going to take that, lie my seam down straight, like so. Oh, make sure my backing is out of the way. Very important. trim my seam, fold this back again, and flip it around and take off 1 more 1/4 of an inch. Like so. Then, when I fold this over, my batting should meet perfectly right in the center where my seam is. Just like that, and that looks pretty good. Now, to hold this down and to keep it butted, I like to use batting seam tape. Something that I can just iron over the top of that and hold it down. You could use Wonder Tape to hold it down. Anything just to hold that batting in place. So here I have a piece of the 1-inch batting seam tape. And I'm just going to plop that down over that seam, head to the ironing board, and press it. I just want to make sure that my batting is butted up against each other, butted up like this. Then I'm going to place the batting seam tape over top, just to make sure that that batting stays where it's supposed to. I don't want it to bunch up when I continue the project. So I'm going to just scoot to the ironing board and get that pressed down. There we are. I have just tacked that down with the batting seam tape, just with some heat. So now we can deal with this. And what we want to do is take this side, or this side, it doesn't matter which one, and we want to cut it down so that it also doesn't overlap. So that'll be our next step, to cut this one down. And this one we have lots of wiggle room. I am going to just cut, it looks like I need to cut about a little more than 1/4 of an inch off of this piece. So I'm going to go about 3/8 or so. And with this one, all I want to do is just cut it down so that it's not going to overlap onto this one. And if it's a little short, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't matter. So I'm just going to give that a quick press with the iron. There we go. It just holds that one side down. And now this side, you can fold it over and fold it over. Like so. Pin that in place. And there we go. Now what we can do, if you don't want to use pins, you can use Wonder Tape, or this would be another great use for the seam-align glue. Just put a little dot right there and dot all the way along. And I just want to tuck that in. There we go. So on the front, we're nice and flat like this. On the back, our seams are covered. And you have options here. You can either hand stitch this. If you want to, just hand stitch that closed. That's why it's kind of nice to use something like Wonder Tape or the seam-align glue, because it'll hold that in place. And you can, or you could even use Steam-a-Seam. I just prefer to use something that's, the Steam-a-Seam tends to be a little bit heavy, and it might make it a little bit harder. So I would just use the Wonder Tape again, or the seam-align, and then I will just hand stitch this closed. If you're just going to hand stitch this and none of your stitching is going to show, don't have to be quite as fussy. Especially when your fabric here is a little bit busy, like this one, where it's a kind of a tone on tone. You are never going to see that seam. And the busier your fabric, the less likely that's ever going to show. Or you could do a stitch with your sewing machine. And here, like this serpentine stitch that I've done here, Looks really great there. You could do just a regular top stitch all the way across here. You just need to remember that whatever you stitch here is going to show up on this side. So if I want to do a decorative stitch down here, you are going to be able to see the underside, the bobbin side of that decorative stitch here. If you are, if you strategically quilt your quilt front, you can leave it so that if you are doing a straight stitch down here, it just becomes part of the quilting pattern. I have also done this in the past using the invisible thread and done this type of a stitch, this serpentine stitch, and that completely hides, you don't really see the invisible stitch. So either way you want to finish that off, that would be your option. So in the instance of the block of the month that we're doing, you've got your medallion. You would completely quilt your medallion, and then the next border that we put on, that would be completely quilted before we attached it to the medallion. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense, and it's just kind of a quick idea as to how to get some, do some quilt as you go with your Courtyard block of the month. So you can go ahead and finish that off any which way your little heart desires. Ta-da and ta-da.